Well, last Count, I have to again express my fury, frankly, that given the shocking content of 2 reports out this week about the scandalous situation in terms of children in homeless accommodation and families in homeless accommodation, that the Senior Minister is not here to take that debate. But maybe it's just indicative of the fact that the situation has become completely indefensible. What the state is now guilty of is nothing short of criminal neglect and child abuse. There's no other way to describe it. When we get a report suggesting that hundreds and hundreds of children in emergency accommodation are unable to learn to crawl, infants, not even children, infants, unable to learn to crawl, to chew, or to speak, or to have anything like a normal developmental pathway, that is criminal abuse and child abuse. It is the Magdalene laundries of the 21st century waiting to happen. And if this continues, we will be looking at redress schemes like we saw for the Magdalene laundries. It is utterly shameful. And it shows just, it's beyond failure now, the government's attempt to address the homelessness and housing emergency that their policies have largely created. Only 8%, according to the Respond report, of those going into emergency accommodation, 15% of whom are there for 2 years or more, 45% who are there more than a year, including, I repeat, hundreds, in excess of 1,000 children, only 8% move on to secure social housing. The rest end up in HAP tenancies, not secure, liable to end up homeless again in the near future, or the other big cohort end up having to go home into overcrowded conditions with their families, or into other emergency accommodation where the torture, the hardship, the neglect and the abuse continues because of the failure of the government to provide secure, affordable public housing on scale to address this housing crisis. 8 years after Fine Gael came into power. And remember, many of these children are now facing into Christmas. The INO and Focus Ireland have now had to give out a resource guide to teachers to deal with homeless children in school because of the stigma they face, the mental trauma they suffer having to go into school every day when they're in this situation of homelessness, where they can't bring their friends home, where they can't have sleepovers. It is absolutely obscene. It's obscene, Minister, but nothing seems to change, nothing seems to move this government.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you. Minister Murphy couldn't be present, but I do thank Deputy Boyd Barrett for raising the issue. I've seen the coverage of the reports, and he's right to raise the points, and they do need to be addressed. The developmental issues in children that have been highlighted are certainly not acceptable. Supporting individuals and families experiencing homelessness is a priority for the government, and over the course of rebuilding Ireland, the government is committed to meeting the housing needs of over 138,000 households, with 50,000 homes delivered through build, acquisition and lease. The implementation of the plan is well underway and is making progress. We can see this reflected in social housing waiting lists, which have reduced by 26% nationally between 2016 and 2019. The government is committed to delivering homes for all of the families currently experiencing homelessness. However, until a home is provided, it's also critical that we provide the appropriate accommodation and supports to households experiencing homelessness. To minimise the use of hotels and B&Bs for emergency accommodation, the government has provided local authorities with capital funding to develop family hubs. There are currently 30 family hubs in operation nationally, and they cater for a total capacity of almost 690 families. Additional hubs will be delivered in the coming months. Hubs provide more security and stability for homeless families that is possible in hotel accommodation. Families in hubs are supported by local authorities and their contracted NGO service delivery partners to identify and secure appropriate long-term accommodation. The supports available in family hubs assist families to move from emergency accommodation to a home within a shorter time frame. The annual report released this morning by Respond, for instance, confirms that, on average, families move out of their hubs within 6 months, with a range of housing responses being provided. These include local authority-owned properties, approved housing body properties, and HAP-supported tenancies in the private rented sector. The objective is to secure a home for a family within a 6-month period, although obviously we work to try and ensure that a home is provided within the shortest period possible. In 2018, 5,135 individual adults and their associated dependents exited homelessness into homes, an increase of 8% on the 2017 figure. In the first half of this year, 2,825 further individual adults and their associated dependents exited homelessness. That's 21% up on the comparable period for last year, 2018. Next year, it's expected that we will see in excess of 5,500 adults and their associated dependents moving out of homelessness. The HAP Place Finder service is playing a vital role in preventing families from entering homelessness in the first place and in housing those families who do find themselves in emergency accommodation. Under the Place Finder service, all local authorities are now being provided with the options to pay deposits and advance rental payments for any households in emergency homeless accommodation in order to secure accommodation via the HAP scheme. Local authorities may, dependent on local demand, offer households in emergency accommodation the option to source accommodation themselves or with the assistance of the Place Finder officers. These officers are being funded by the Department. 23 local authorities have such officers in place, and more than 9,300 households have been supported by the Homeless HAP scheme nationally up to the end of Q3 of this year. Supporting a household to exit homelessness sometimes requires, in fact, often requires more than just a house. Sometimes it requires a broader suite of social and welfare supports. In that context, it's vital that the range of state bodies act in a coordinated fashion and a high-level inter-agency group, including representatives from key government departments, local authorities and agencies like TUSLA and the HSE, is in place to support this critical coordination objective.
Can I get 2 minutes, Deputy Boyd Barrett?
Honestly, for the government to say that council housing lists have reduced, it just makes me want to scream, right? Do you know why they've reduced? In large part, because you've refused to lift the income thresholds. So every single week, there's people coming into my clinic who've been lopped off the list, who are still desperately in need of housing, but because their income has creeped a few euro over the income threshold. Income thresholds that have not been raised for about a decade. So this is the new plan for the government to reduce the housing lists, is just chop people off the housing lists, and for less and less people to be entitled to social housing, even though there's no other options available to them, dragging a whole new cohort of people into the housing crisis. And similarly, to mention HAPs just makes me want to scream as well, last Count Corley. Do you know, I was talking to the Place Finders office in Dunleary Down. She told me, not that I didn't know, but she confirmed, because they're supposed to find places, HAPS places. She said one-bedroom apartments in Sandyford are now going for €2,000 a month. €2,000, one bedroom, right? Do you know what the limit is for one bedroom? Homeless HAP, one bedroom, 975. Forget it, right? That's why nobody's moving out of homeless accommodation, because the money being provided by the state is not enough to get even halfway to the level of rents. And even if you manage to get into HAP tenancy, you could be homeless again in 6 months' time, because there's nothing secure about them. And meanwhile, in O'Devany Gardens and sites all over the country, you're selling off public land that could be used for public housing to provide secure, affordable housing. That is why we're in this mess. And I'll just conclude by saying this. Count, there's a demonstration of housing protesters on the 5th of December to coincide with the anniversary of the death of Jonathan Corrie. Those protesters have asked, and I'm glad to say the Dáil Business Committee has agreed, that there will be a debate in here on solutions to the housing crisis on the day of that rally. But I can tell you one thing, that they are out there protesting several years after the death of Jonathan Corrie because the government have not provided any solutions other than ones that have made the situation worse.
I think the Deputy is right in the sense of the need which is happening now for a review of the thresholds. I don't accept that the full 26% is as a result of people's incomes going over the existing thresholds, but that review is starting to get in train. It didn't happen for a decade because there was a decade of incomes were fairly flat, but incomes are starting to rise, and he's right to point out that. And I certainly, the issue of, and I don't like getting into individual cases, but the Jonathan Corrie case was horrific, you know, many agencies, including government, have a responsibility. But I would emphasise to the Deputy, and he knows himself, that in that particular case and in many others, part of the answer that spoke about the other supports that people need in relation to homelessness is crucial. And homelessness is caused by surely economic reasons for absolute certain, but there are other factors that contribute. But having said that, we will be proceeding with the review of the thresholds. It is something that is timely at this stage, but I don't think that answers the 26% in total.